Hey guys, tonight we begin with the absolutely miserable, awkward, and often misunderstood life of the caveman. The one person in prehistory who had absolutely no job security, no government salary, and definitely no dinner party invitations. Because, well, there weren't even dinner parties yet. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You weren't born gnawing on mammoth bones or making cave paintings by torchlight. Like most prehistoric children, you came into the world in a damp, shadowy cave that smelled like wet rock, old animal hides, and something vaguely smoky. You were small, quiet, maybe a little too curious about bugs. Nobody thought much of it until you started poking at fire instead of running away from it. While other kids threw pebbles and tried to chase lizards, you were the one trying to figure out why bones crack a certain way and asking your parents why the sky made noises at night. Not in a this child will invent language way. More in a this child will wander off in the dark and worry the whole tribe way. By the time you were 10, you already knew how to sharpen a stick. Not for hunting, just because you liked the way it felt in your hand. You weren't violent. You were curious, which in a prehistoric tribe was a dangerous thing to be. You didn't come from anything that could be called wealth. Your father was probably the one who could make a fire on the first try, or maybe he was just the best at hauling water from the creek. Your mother might have collected roots or whispered things about animal tracks in ways that made the elders uneasy. You weren't cursed. You were just available. Then came the day someone suggested an opportunity. Maybe an old woman, maybe the tribe leader, looked at you small, quiet, always watching, and said, "That one isn't afraid of the dark, is he?" That was the caveman version of a job offer. Soon after, you found yourself apprenticed. Not to a hunter or a painter, but to a person whose main skill was knowing where the safest part of the cave was and how to stay quiet when the hyenas came close. They didn't smile much. They didn't explain much either. Just pointed at things and expected you to figure it out. A pile of furs here, a stack of old bones there, a lump of clay that no one talked about. You fetched water. You gathered sticks. You were told not to ask what the painted symbols meant. You started having questions. Then you started learning not to ask them. At night, you slept lightly, not out of fear, but because the cave was never silent. The wind moaned at the entrance. Water dripped from the ceiling. And sometimes you thought you heard footsteps that weren't human. And that's how it began. Not with a flash of brilliance, just with a quiet child, a restless tribe, and a job nobody else wanted. You never officially chose the path. It just sort of happened to you. One day you were helping your mother grind berries or gathering moss near the river. The next you were standing at the edge of the firelight with a small bundle of dried meat, a worn animal skin, and instructions to go learn from the old cave watcher. The old cave watcher wasn't actually related to you. No one really knew if he had family. He lived near the darkest part of the cave. Not so far that he seemed mysterious, but far enough that nobody wanted to sleep next to him. He had a pile of rocks that he arranged for no obvious reason, a stash of sticks, and a surprisingly large collection of odd-shaped stones. You didn't ask questions. That was rule number 1. The watcher didn't talk much. He wasn't mean, just practical. You'd arrive in the morning, and he'd be sitting in the shadows, sharpening something that didn't look quite like a tool. He taught you how to stack firewood, mix clay with water, and patch holes in the animal skins. If you asked what it was for, he'd just grunt. If you guessed correctly, he'd grunt louder. Your first week was spent scraping moss off rocks, organizing stones by shape, and learning how to stack bones without getting bitten by bugs. It was all very mechanical. No explanations, no emotional commentary, just tasks. In the evenings, the watcher would sit near the embers, staring at the wall. You sat across from him, trying not to make noise. Occasionally, he'd hand you a stick with carving symbols you didn't understand, marks about how the stars moved or how to tell when the cave would flood. You didn't get all of it, but you understood it was important. Once you tried to talk to another kid your age near the riverbank. He asked what you were learning. You said honestly how to keep fires from going out too early. He didn't talk to you again after that. By the end of the first month, you knew how to tie 4 different types of knots using animal sinew, how to identify bones by their shape, some for tools, some for soup, and how to scrape moss from a rock without letting your hands go numb from the cold stream. You weren't being taught a trade. You were being taught quiet. Your first real day on the job didn't begin with any kind of ritual. No painted handprint, no welcoming ceremony, no welcome to the Order of Watchers. It started with a stick, a heavy old branch, pressed into your palm with a grunt from the old watcher. Back of the cave, you know the way, he said, as if you'd been waiting your whole life to go there. Down the narrow passage you crept, holding a smoldering branch in one hand and your sense of courage in the other. The air got colder with every step. Not refreshing cold, more like forgotten underworld cold. The kind that gets into your skin and stays there, making up stories in the dark. The room at the back wasn't large, but it made up for it in unease. Low ceiling, walls blackened by centuries of fire and smoke. A flat stone in the center, worn smooth by who knows what. Furs piled in one corner. A shelf of flint knives and stone scrapers that looked like teeth. In another corner, a basket. Always a basket. The old watcher didn't explain anything. He just pointed. Clear that out. Sweep the ashes. And never leave the water skins loose. Last time they leaked, and it took days for the smell to go away. You nodded. You were 15, maybe 16, and already too deep in to pretend you didn't understand. You scraped and cleaned without asking what you were scraping. You wiped down stone tools and animal bones that clearly hadn't been moved since the last feast or the last disaster. That afternoon, someone was brought in. Not for you, not yet, but you were told to stay, to observe, to learn pacing. Apparently, even survival had a rhythm. The woman in the corner said nothing for a long time. Then she started mumbling to herself. You weren't asked to help, just to keep things tidy. Replace a moss mat here. Refill a water skin there. You did as told, trying not to look too closely at anything. When it was done, the watcher handed you a clump of moss and gestured at the stone. No one else cleans, he said. That was your welcome. Later, you sat by the embers, your hands still cold and smelling like river clay. The watcher sat nearby, chewing on something. You didn't speak, not because you were afraid, but because you already understood something. The job didn't want questions. It just wanted quiet, obedient hands. And yours, apparently, were perfect. After a few weeks of successful silence, the watcher gave you something like a promotion. Your first set of work skins. It wasn't a robe. It wasn't ceremonial. It was an animal hide vest, stiff from use, and a pair of wrappings for your hands that had definitely seen better days. He handed them over without comment, as if this was a normal milestone. No fanfare, no warning, just, you'll need these. The stones are worse than the cold. You held them like they might crawl away. The vest was thick, patched in places, and smelled like damp fur with a hint of smoke. The hand wraps were heavier than you expected, double layered, probably to help with carrying things you didn't want to touch, but had to anyway. You put them on. They fit. There was no mask, no paint, no secret mark like the stories say. Cave watchers didn't get mystery. You had a face, and everyone eventually recognized it. Out in the tribe, it didn't matter if you wore the gear or not. People could tell. It was something in your posture alert, slightly hunched, always ready to duck if a branch or a stray question came your way. You could be wearing your best fur, and people would still avoid making eye contact. The hand wraps became your signature. You started wearing them out of habit, even when gathering roots, even when eating. It wasn't pride. It was convenience. You never knew when you'd be asked to carry something heavy, or wet, or both. And then there were the shoes. Not really shoes, just heavy wrappings, layered for the slippery cave floors, which is all we'll say about that. Walking in them made a sound, a soft, final sort of scuff. People learned to recognize it. Mothers would gather their children. Elders would suddenly become fascinated with the sky. You once tried smiling at a girl while picking berries. She looked at your hand wraps, your foot wraps, your general air of I move stones in the dark, and promptly dropped her basket. The uniform wasn't just fur and sinew. It was a warning label. It told the world, this person is useful, but not touchable. And that's exactly how they treated you. Once you'd proven yourself capable, meaning you could tie a knot, follow instructions, and not panic when startled the tribe offered you your own sleeping space. Calling it a cave was generous. It was more of a stone alcove at the back of the main shelter, just far enough from the fire that you were always cold, but close enough that you could hear everything. Things like the low grumbling of elders at night, when nobody should be grumbling, or the scrape of stone against stone, or the shifting of furs in the dark. The space came with exactly 2 perks: a heavy skin to hang in the doorway, and a pile of furs high enough to keep you off the damp ground. Most nights, anyway. There were also smells. Constant, subtle, deeply confusing. The place smelled like someone had once tried to wash it with old water and given up halfway through. There was a mix of smoldering moss, wet earth, and something vaguely animal you learned not to ask about. Your first week living there, a shaman dropped off a bundle of sweet grass with a note scratched on bark that simply read, "Burn this, please." Thoughtful, if a little ominous. The location had its advantages. You were always close to work. Tragically close, in fact. If a chief or elder needed something in the middle of the night, you were 5 steps away. No excuses, no hiding, just ever-present obligation. Neighbors? None. The nearest occupied cave was on the other side of the shelter, and even they avoided eye contact if you passed by. You were your own neighborhood. Population. You and a family of bats who didn't care what you did. You tried to make it homey, maybe arrange a few painted rocks, a strip of animal hide, a sad attempt at a moss mat that wilted within days. You once hung a feather charm. It fell off the wall almost immediately, as if the alcove itself rejected anything decorative. Sleep came eventually fitful, shallow, never deep enough. You got used to the groans, the shuffling, the late-night footsteps you pretended not to hear. You developed the ability to wake instantly, but never to rest completely. It wasn't haunted, not exactly. It was just heavy with memory. Not yours, but everyone else's. It pressed in the silence like smoke you couldn't wave away. Welcome home. In theory, you were a vital member of the tribe. Emphasis on vital. In practice, the only thing vital about you was how vitally everyone avoided you. People didn't talk to you. They talked around you, like you were a slippery patch of mud on the trail they were trying not to step in. If you sat near the fire, the circle seemed to shrink in that direction. Children were hurried away. Dogs stared, then lost interest. You weren't officially banned from feasts or gatherings, but somehow you never heard when they were happening. Naming ceremonies. Oh, you must have been busy with the rocks. The big hunt? Ah, we thought you'd rather be near the caves. Your presence, it seemed, didn't pair well with celebration. At market, traders met your eyes with the kind of careful respect reserved for spear tips and thorn bushes. You got your share. Yes, but always a little dry, a little tough, and always with the suggestion that you keep moving. You paid in shells or bone like everyone else, but the fruit was always a little underripe, the meat always a little stringy. Once, in a bold moment, you tried to join a group by the river. They laughed, shared water, told stories. You smiled, stepped forward. One glance at your hand, wraps not stained, just recognizable, and the laughter trailed away. You stood holding your basket and quietly turned back. Friendship wasn't impossible, just highly unlikely. Other tradesfolk had groups. Toolmakers had jokes. Even the tribe's outcast had a kind of audience. You had the watcher, who once grunted at you and said, "You're less useless than most." High praise. There were no romantic prospects, either. If someone looked at you twice, it was probably to make sure they could describe you accurately to the elders later. You didn't get secret smiles. You got bits of bark slipped into your hand that said things like, "Don't pick my child for the night watch, please," mostly. And yet, you weren't hated. That would imply passion. You were simply regarded as necessary, but unfortunate like mud in spring or long winters. You weren't really part of the tribe. You were adjacent to it, lingering just outside the fire's glow, waiting to be summoned. And honestly, most days, you preferred it that way. Down a winding path behind the main shelter, past a low archway nobody ever crawled under unless they had to, was your workspace. Affectionately called by the others that place. They never said more. They didn't have to. It wasn't a room. It was a mood. The walls were stone, but not smooth scraped, gouged, stained, full of little marks no one bothered to count. There were no windows, just a small hole high in the rock where sunlight sometimes found you, never enough to win the battle against the shadows. In the center was the table. Not a table, really, just a flat boulder worn hollow by centuries of use. Around it, ropes of sinew coiled at each corner, like props for a play nobody enjoyed. There was a sitting rock, not for resting, just the rock. The wall niches held your few tool-sharpened bones, stone scrapers, oddly shaped sticks, the greatest hits of ancient anxiety. Some looked useful. Some looked like they'd been invented by accident. There were things with notches, things with grooves, and one object that buzzed when the wind blew, which you simply ignored for the sake of peace. In one corner, the bucket. No one talked about the bucket. No label, no owner, no explanation, just an unspoken presence. You cleaned it out of duty, not curiosity. The smell was complicated, a mix of whetstone, burnt moss, and something old that settled in your lungs like a memory you'd rather not keep. You tried herbs. You tried smoke. Once you tried hanging wildflowers. They shriveled by morning. Your watcher insisted on tidiness. A messy workspace is a careless one. They grumble, lining up bone awls and stone scrapers with a stick. You learn to sweep, to polish, to replace cracked rope before it snapped. This wasn't cruelty. It was just maintenance. You didn't decorate. No paintings, no shells, just a shelf for your hand wraps and a small, smoothed log where you'd sometimes sit, thinking about how silence could throb like a heartbeat. And yet, it was yours. No one else entered. No one touched your tools, because no one wanted to. No one tells you this, but the job requires math. Not the fun kind with counting berries or tracking the moon. Your specialty was pain math, a strange arithmetic of pressure, angle, and how long a body part could hold out under moderately Paleolithic circumstances. You knew, for instance, that the average elbow couldn't twist past a certain angle without a bad pop. You didn't read that in a scroll. You learned it the hard way through trial, error, and watching others wince. There were no charts, no rules, just mental notes and a kind of intuition you'd find in toolmakers and healers. You had to know what was enough, and when a bit more became too much, the watcher taught you the basics. 3 twists to warn, 4 for truth, 5 if the hunter still denied raiding the meat stash. They weren't joking. Tribal justice was about balance. Enough discomfort to teach a lesson. Not so much that you lost a tribe member for the winter. Your tools didn't come with instructions, but you learned their tolerances like a hunter knows his spear. The scraper glided smooth if oiled. The club creaked when it was about to split. The stone band had a sweet spot between snug and disaster. Precision was everything. People assumed you were just a brute, grunting and swinging until something gave. In reality, you were more like a cook, timing, pressure, control, all vital. The difference was, no one clapped when you were done. Over time, you developed a kind of sixth sense. You could look at someone and know how many moments they'd last before confessing to sneaking the best marrow bone. It wasn't pride, just pattern. But the worst part? When you were right too often, when your calculations were flawless, that's when the elders started calling you in. She still says she didn't take the honey, they'd mutter, glancing at your hands. Maybe help her remember. No mention of justice, no explanation, just the expectation that you'd get results like an unpleasant medicine man. Most days, you were invisible. People saw you, of course. They'd turn aside when you passed, murmur to their gods, stare too long at the fire, anything to avoid your eyes. But they didn't talk to you. Not unless they had to. Unless, of course, they needed something. Then suddenly, you were essential. An elder would appear at your alcove, trying to look casual but reeking of worry. "We need the truth by sundown," they'd say. No mention of right or wrong, just the expectation you'd produce results, like a particularly unlovable cook. Other times, it was the shaman insisting this was all about spiritual cleansing. The soul must be encouraged to return to the right path. Encouragement in this case involved animal sinew, glowing embers, and a cave with no exit. Growth through discomfort, you might say. Even the traders would sometimes send a whisper, never outright. Of course, that a rival had been grunting about certain things. Nothing official, mind you. Just if you're gathering roots today, maybe you wander past his shelter and offer a look. You were never formally asked. That would have meant real involvement. Instead, you'd get vague nods. A piece of dried meat left near your bed. A note drawn in the sand that said, "For keeping peace." Peace was always popular. But when your help was done, nothing. The elder would go back to pretending you were invisible. The shaman would forget your soul existed. The trader would overcharge you for the worst fish. Your usefulness had a half-life, maybe 2 groans long, and you learned to accept it. Not out of pride, just necessity. If you waited for thanks, you'd starve waiting. Your reward was not being chased off. A warm corner and the occasional hunk of bread that wasn't all fungus. You were a bucket in a drought nobody notices until there's a fire. Then suddenly, where's the enforcer? And when the drama was over, just muddy footprints and silence. The cave was stone. Stone floors, stone walls, stone ceiling. All very solid. All very echoey. That was the first challenge. No one warned you about the sound. Caveman engineering wasn't exactly about acoustics. Actually, it seemed designed to amplify noise, especially the kind that makes hunting dinner much less appealing. The cries, when they came, didn't just happen and vanish. They bounced along the cave, out the entrance, down into the riverbed, and on a humid night, all the way to the sleeping grounds. And they stayed. You'd finish a session, scrub your tools, wash your hands, grunt something philosophical like, "Well, that was loud." And you'd still hear it later, a whisper above your head, like the rocks themselves wanted to remember. Your watcher called it echoes. You tried everything, stuffing moss into cracks, rearranging the hides, even asking the builder for quiet rocks. He just stared at you like you'd asked for a mammoth rug in summer. Eventually, you adapted. You learned to separate real cries from old ones, could even tell which ones were from morning and which were leftovers from the hunt 2 days ago. A primitive sort of sound cataloging. The tribe claimed not to hear it, But they also claimed you weren't technically part of the group, which is a polite way of saying, we hear it, we're just pretending it's wind. At night, it got stranger. The sleeping area was quiet too quiet. Then a shuffle, an echo, and suddenly you were awake, listening for a threat. You started sleeping with your hand wraps on, not for safety, just comfort. They made you feel ready, like you could grab a stick and defend yourself against shadows. Some enforcers went mad from it, so the story said. You didn't. You just got used to being followed, not by people, but by reverberation. The job didn't haunt you. The cave's memory did. And honestly, that might have been worse. You'd think a job involving confession, fear, and the occasional overzealous hunter would come with rewards. You'd be wrong. Your pay wasn't just bad. It was erratic, unclear, and sometimes involved old cheese. Officially, you helped the tribe. Unofficially, you survived on whatever scraps could be spared. Some berries here, a share of honey there, a fur left by someone hoping their cousin would be spared next time. Some moons you got a spearhead. Other times, a handful of roots with a shrug. Once, a chicken. It looked like it had already heard stories about you. There was no salary, only the vague promise that your role mattered, which in cave speak meant, don't ask for more. You kept count in notches on a stick, not because you expected to get even, but because it felt like something a grown-up with a job would do. Your mentor once told you, you'll never be the richest, but they'll always need you. Comforting or threatening? Hard to say. You tried negotiating once, approached the elder and explained that good rope was rare. Firewood didn't gather itself, and river stones broke. He agreed, nodded, and then handed you half a dried fish and a thank you for being discreet. You couldn't exactly quit. Not like there was a line of volunteers. And even if you left, what would you tell the next tribe? Good with knots, knows how to pressure a confession, can carry heavy rocks. So you stayed, you budgeted, you reused bones, you patched hand wraps, you cooked stews from things that should not go in stews. You made it work. The irony, of course, your work involved applying pressure, but you lived under it. The tribe feared your sticks and bones, but when the meat ran out, you feared the big hunters, and they never haggled. Contrary to legend, justice among early humans wasn't just a free-for-all of violence and wild ideas. There were rules. Not good rules, not clear rules, but definitely rules. For example, you couldn't just drag someone in for stealing berries. You needed permission, usually from the elder, sometimes from the shaman, and once from a man who claimed to be the moon's cousin. The group said confession was a last resort, which usually meant we tried talking for 10 minutes, and now we're tired. There were guidelines. You weren't allowed to permanently break anyone. Not officially, anyway. Anything that left someone unable to gather food, run, or remember fire was not ideal. Unless, of course, they confessed, then it was just a sad necessity. You had to keep records, sort of. Usually this meant marking rocks or sticks with vague symbols like unhelpful applied pressure more grunting. The shaman often sat in, mostly to ensure the spirits weren't angered while you tested what a shoulder could handle. He rarely intervened unless it was time to chant or grab a snack. And yes, some techniques were off limits. Iron cages? Not a thing. Too heavy. Too imaginary. You made do with what you had: sticks, rocks, your hands. All without cool names, just the twisty stick or that sharp bone. What this meant was you lived in a limbo where pain was allowed, but just barely. Always one bad session away from being called too rough, which could mean exile or promotion, depending who was watching. So yes, tribal justice was regulated, just not in a way that made anyone feel safer. There were no celebrations, no farewell gifts, no painted handprint in your honor. You didn't retire from this job. You just stopped getting called if you were lucky. The work didn't come with a plan for old age. No one explained what happened when your hands grew stiff or you couldn't see in the dark. You just got slower, less sure. And when precision is the difference between getting a confession and starting a feud, that's not ideal. Your old mentor never really retired either. One morning, he handed you his best digging stick, nodded like he was passing down a lucky flint, and simply wandered out of camp into the mist, becoming just another fireside rumor. No one saw him again. You figured he probably found a quiet spot by the river and spent his last days sharpening bones. As for you, you knew you wouldn't last that long. There were always stories, always whispered of enforcers who tried to leave. Some wandered to a distant valley, tried to live as hunters or gatherers, even claimed to have started a berry-selling stand by the foraging trails. But somehow, the Tales caught up with them, and when the new tribe found out their dried berries came from the hand of someone who once broke legs, sales dried up quick. One ex-enforcer tried to be a shaman's assistant. His herbal cures were shockingly effective, so effective, in fact, that he was soon accused of witchcraft and run off with stones. Last anyone heard, he was living as a lookout on the cliffs voluntarily. The truth? Your reputation followed you like the smell of old fire. It seeped into your hair, your walk, your eyes. Even if you quit, no one forgot. You weren't the spear carver, the hide tanner, or the healer. You were the one with that cave. So you stayed quiet, took on a helper, accepted fewer requests, learned to listen more and punish less. The tribe, for its part, just pretended you still existed. Eventually, you knew someone else would take over. They always did. When the time came, maybe you'd wander out like your mentor, into the dawn, into a clearing, into that part of the world where nobody asked what you'd done. But not yet. You still had work. Years passed. Hunters came and went. Cold seasons, floods, fevers. But you remained, always on the edge, like a stubborn tree. Nobody bothered to cut. Nobody said it, but everyone knew. You were part of the tribe's structure now, a necessity nobody wanted to name. You never expected a legacy. Enforcers don't get those. They get whispered about, blamed for curses, sometimes featured in scary stories, told to keep children close to the fire. Kids wondered if you slept upside down. Teenagers dared each other to touch the cave door. Adults looked past you, but also expected you to appear whenever things went wrong. Elders spoke your name quietly, not out of honor, but of relief. You were reliable, quiet, the human equivalent of a big club kept behind a rock. You never had a mate who would you approach. Hello, I convince people to tell the truth with a stick. Want to share some berries? Friends, rare? Your apprentice was the closest thing, poor kid, who finally stopped asking questions and started sorting tools just like you once did. You taught him everything, even how to keep his hands from cracking in winter. He never thanked you, which meant he was paying attention. One year, a wandering holy man asked to enforce the rules here. The chief just pointed your way. The holy man nodded, never asked your name, and when stories spread, you were never mentioned, just the one in the cave. A role more than a person, a necessary part, like the fire pit or the spear rack. Once you considered carving your mark on a boulder near the cave entrance, but it felt pointless. The cave already remembered you. If you left anything behind, it wasn't a drawing or a pile of trophies. It was a hush. The quiet after someone finally confessed. The wide circle around your sleeping spot. The cave mouth that never needed a sign, because everyone knew. And when you were gone, no one would talk about it, which felt right. In ancient times, a seat at a tribal feast was more than just a meal. It was a signal, a maneuver, and sometimes a trap disguised as generosity. If you got invited, you were useful, interesting, or someone to be watched. No written invites. An elder simply gestured, or a runner called your name across the fire. For leaders, it wasn't about eating. It was about being seen, Refusing could mean trouble, and showing up empty-handed or badly dressed could brand you an outcast for seasons. Miss one feast, and suddenly rumors of injury, disgrace, or bad luck might stick to your reputation like mud. The ordinary gatherers? Not invited. Even skilled hunters had to earn their place by sharing a kill, marrying well, or currying favor with gifts. If you were summoned with no warning, the host wanted to test you or use you. Once invited, preparations began. You sharpened your best bone comb, patched your hide cloak, and made sure to arrive with something berries, meat, or a well-told tale. Where you sat around the fire mattered. Closer to the chief meant power and trust. Farther away, you were one spilled bowl from exile. The politics didn't end there. How you arrived mattered. Some came with family, carrying trophies, showing off new furs and sharp stones. Others slipped in quietly, hoping to hear gossip rather than be noticed. What nobody ever admitted out loud was this: tribal feasts were pure theater. The fire's host was the director, the guests were actors, and the food, whether it was mammoth marrow or boiled root, was the script. To get invited meant stepping onto the stage, and whether you left to applause or were quietly shunned from the next gathering depended entirely on how well you played your part. Nobody just wandered into a Stone Age feast. That'd be like showing up to the chieftain's fire in muddy fur's instant disaster. Arrivals were performances, calculated, orchestrated, and sometimes downright comic. Picture this: the clearing alive with crackling torches, tree shadows flickering across hides stretched between posts, the scent of smoke, pine resin, and suspense drifting in the air. Then a shout echoes out loud enough to startle a dog. Another hunter has returned. The trail parts, and in comes a procession. A big-shouldered hunter with a painted face, not in armor, but decorated in beads, feathers, and a necklace of teeth. Behind him, relatives hustle in, dragging baskets of roots or awkwardly balancing a giant boar's head as tribute to the host. Every step was a silent contest: who brought the best trophy, whose tunic had the most intricate bone toggles, whose hair was combed with the jawbone of something impressive. But not every arrival was a parade. Some guests slipped in quietly, hoods up, eyes low, giving only a nod to the gate guard, usually the quiet types, the scouts, or the ones hoping to overhear more than be seen. At the circle, every arrival was announced, sometimes loudly by a child bellowing, sometimes with a subtle tap of a staff. Here comes Oak Shoulder, who speared the river bull. By the time the stories ended, the soup was cold. Once in, each guest gave a quick scan. Who's already here? Who's not? Who dares to wear a wolf pelt to a bear hunter's table? Every grin hid calculations. Every welcome was measured. This was more than food. It was diplomacy by firelight and mammoth bone spoon. Meanwhile, helpers fluttered in the background, whisking away mud-caked cloaks, passing gourds of mead, and muttering seating hints. One misstep, a big hunter seated too close to the chief, or a rival clan stuck in the smoky spot by the fire, and trouble started before the first bite. The way you arrived set the tone. Cheers, muttering, envy, dread. Whether you swaggered in like a hero or slunk in like a shadow, once you crossed the logs that marked the feast's edge, the games had begun. You'd think sitting around the fire would be the easiest part, but even here, where you plopped your backside, was as delicate as balancing on a log in a storm. The high spot by the main fire was for the host and the highest status guests: the chief, the shaman, visiting leaders, and anyone the clan needed to flatter or fear. Every placement mattered. Sit one space too far to the left, and you looked like your days were numbered. Too close, and the whispers started favoritism, ambition. Around this core, the circle spread out: top hunters, seasoned elders, then young warriors, then distant cousins, then the unlucky or unpopular out near the logs where the wind blew smoke in your face. If you found yourself next to the supply baskets, or by the dung pile, you'd better start hunting harder. But it wasn't just about distance from the fire. It was about visibility. Who could see you? Who could you be seen with? Sitting next to a rising star could boost your own fortunes. Sitting beside someone who just caused a scandal? Eat fast and keep your head down. And then there was the matter of the salt, or rather, the rare honey. Those sitting near the honey pot were considered important. Those with only plain roots in front of them? Not so much. It was an edible status symbol, a culinary caste system. Last-minute surprises abounded, too. If a stranger appeared or a rival guest showed up, the seating circle would shift, quietly but firmly, with the subtlety of an avalanche. A single misplaced hide could start a grudge that lasted until the next mammoth season. For the guests, sitting down wasn't about comfort. It was about keeping one eye on everyone else and both ears open. Every glance, every joke, every mouthful taken before the chief's first bite was a signal. The feast hadn't even started, but the real contest was already underway. The moment the host raised their drinking horn, the circle transformed. Conversations hushed, music makers paused, all eyes fixed on the main fire. A toast was made usually to the spirits, the ancestors, or the luck of the tribe. And then, with a shout or the drop of a staff, the meal began. Forget your modern three-course meal. Tribal feasts came in waves, each more ambitious than the last. The first round might be humble trays of roasted tubers, strings of dried berries, bone marrow soup. But by the second or third round, all bets were off. Whole haunches of mammoth, charred fish with pine sap glaze, baskets of wild eggs still warm from the nest. These weren't just dinner, they were spectacle. Food was performance, and there were no plates. Guests scooped with slabs of bark, cracked bones to slurp the marrow, or simply devoured with their hands until the grease slicked their chins and knuckles. Tools? Maybe a sharpened stone or a family heirloom antler. A fork? That was the stuff of suspicious outsiders. Every dish sent a message. A fat boar's head dominance. Rare honey fortune and trade. A roasted root dyed purple proof you'd found something mysterious in the bog. The display was as important as the flavor. Clever cooks might sculpt bowls from ice, pile berries in spirals, or carve a turnip into a bear's head. And if you could get the clan to gasp, your spot at the fire and a prime share of meat were basically guaranteed. Not everyone tasted everything. Food went out by rank. Top hunters and elders got the first cuts, whole racks of ribs or hearts still steaming from the fire, while others made do with chewy scraps, burnt crust, or the half-cooked tubers rescued from the ash. This was no all-you-can-eat affair. The food chain had a food chain, and status was measured in bites. The helpers moved between the circles, balancing baskets, calling out names, whispering who brought what, and quietly hoping not to spill a single berry. Drop a bone into the fire? Lose your spot. Spill soup on the shaman's lap? Hope you like fetching firewood. As courses rolled out, the noise around the fire swelled. Laughter grew rowdy. Mead sloshed, and shouts echoed into the woods. The meal wasn't just filling bellies. It was feeding pride, pecking order, and clan ambition. And the night was still young. Stone Age feasts weren't just about gnawing a roasted haunch and licking honey off your wrists. They were full-blown shows. When one course finished, the next spectacle began. While cooks shuffled around the pit to check the next batch of meat, the fire's attention turned to entertainment. First up, the clan fool, a wiry youth with a knack for impressions and a face painted in mud. Don't let the monkey skin hat fool you. A good joker could insult a chief and live to see sunrise. A bad one risked a rain of chewed bones. Their dances, tumbling tricks, and sharp jabs kept tempers from boiling over unless, of course, they aimed their jokes at the wrong cousin. Then came the music makers. Hollowed bone flutes, stretched hide drums, rhythmic sticks thumping on logs, his singers wailed songs of ancient hunts, legendary fires, or embarrassing mishaps in the berry patch. Occasionally, a big shot might request a song about themselves, hoping their deeds would echo in the next valley over. For grander gatherings, entertainment got weirder. Old men would wrestle in the mud. Children would reenact the bear chase from last moon, wearing masks made from leaves. Sometimes, a trader with shiny beads would try to tell fortunes or balance a fish on their nose for laughs. And if the chief really wanted to show off, maybe a fire breather, someone who could spit honeyed sap into the flames and make the sparks leap. The shaman hated that. But the crowd wasn't just passive. A well-told story might earn a chunk of honeycomb. And you'd get cheers or a handful of old roots hurled at your feet. The shows were dazzling, sure, but they were also cover. In the shadows behind the flames, conversations hummed. Promises exchanged, grievances aired, deals struck. Lovers snuck glances, rivals whispered threats. For every joke or dance in the firelight, a dozen serious plots unfolded just outside its glow. As mead continued to flow and spirits rose, the feast grew rowdier, the boundaries between laughter and plotting melting away. By the feast's midpoint, restraint was on its last legs, and mead, or beer, or some homemade spirit, was the one pushing it over the edge. Stone Age gatherings didn't ration drinks. They poured and passed gourds in endless loops, urging toasts for every occasion: good hunts, fat babies, clear weather, or even a funny-shaped turnip. Didn't matter. The goal: keep everyone loose, happy, and too tipsy to fight about the burned meat. But drinking wasn't just fun. It was a tool. A well-timed refill could make a rival let slip a secret, a boastful cousin embarrass themselves, or a would-be suitor sing a song they'd regret. The host watched closely. Who drank what? Who held their drink? Who was pretending to sip, but really tipping out their share to the dogs? Send an extra cup to loosen a stubborn guest, or keep a rival from noticing you slip out for a secret chat. Some handled their spirits like seasoned hunters, calm and quiet, watching others unravel. Others, less so, giggling in the ferns, challenging each other to races around the fire, or dozing off before the main event. Alcohol turned the serious into fools, but even in the chaos, there were rules. Drink with your right hand, never before the chief. Never leave your cup upside down, or the ancestors would be offended. But as the drink flowed, even the rules blurred. Arguments settled, new alliances formed, old ones fell apart, and somewhere in the confusion, a bone flute would play a song no one quite remembered. By night's peak, some guests were howling at the moon, others were napping in the grass, and a few were simply trying to focus on the next bite. The feast was far from over, but by now, the line between celebration and scheming had completely disappeared. In a Stone Age feast, not all appetites were created equal. While the Stone Age feast might have looked like a wild, anything-goes pile of charred meat and sticky berries, every mouthful was deeply political, just as much a scoreboard as sustenance. Let's start with the obvious, the fire's inner ring. Here sat the top hunters, elders, and anyone with enough scars or stories to claim pride of place. They didn't just get the first cut of mammoth or the plumpest berries. They got the choicest marrow bones, fresh eggs, the biggest shanks, and honeycomb that still dripped. The shaman's share, served with a flourish of bone, knife stuck right in, a special bark cup of fermented drink, or perhaps a sweet tuber roasted just so. Their cups never emptied, and the best pieces landed on their bark mats with little nods of respect. A little farther out, just beyond the best light, were the second circle hunters' helpers, healers, skilled tool makers, and the big cousins with extra muscles. Their bowls looked similar, but the flavors were blender and the cuts were leaner. Instead of tongue, maybe they got shoulder meat. Instead of fresh-caught fish, maybe dried strips, or if someone liked you, a scoop of hot broth, poured from the chief's own cooking pot. Feasting here was classic trickle-down leftover drippings, not prime bites. On the outer edge were the youth, the occasional trader, visiting cousins, or anyone the clan needed, but didn't exactly want in the spotlight. Their share? Charred tubers, leftover marrow, berries already a little wrinkled, or a bone someone else had already cracked open. If they were lucky, they might get a pinch of herbs or a splash of mead, though usually watered down. For them, food was about not going hungry and hoping next time they'd get a seat closer to the fire. And then there were the workers' fire keepers, wood gatherers, the ones who ran errands all night or kept watch at the cave mouth. Their meal? Maybe scraps, maybe a chunk of cold meat pressed into their hand after everyone else was done. Maybe just the right to lick the pot. Leftovers became their treasure, and even the bones were divided by an unspoken but strict code. The fool might score a greasy skin. The kid who fetched water all night got a handful of berries, maybe a half-burnt crust from the edge of the fire pit. But the biggest humiliation wasn't what you ate. It was how you got it. If you were high status, food was presented with a little nod, sometimes a chant. If you were nobody, it was a quick toss, maybe a grunt eat or don't, your call. Sometimes you had to pass your bark tray around the fire and hope something was left when it came back. Sit far enough away, and your share might be nothing but cold ashes. Every bite was a living reminder of who mattered and who was just there to keep the fire burning. While the main circle echoed with jokes, drumbeats, and rowdy shouts, the true chaos boiled behind the scenes at the cooking pit, a smoky, seething chaos of hunger, heat, and hope. Forget the image of a wise old cook gently tending the stew. The Stone Age kitchen was a frantic ecosystem. Fire stokers, stick turners, ash scrapers, and foragers rushing in with the next handful of greens. The kid whose job it was to spin the meat might spend hours squinting through smoke, his arms burning, praying someone would take pity and swap out. Then came the flavorers, the wise ones who knew which bark made broth taste sweet, which roots to roast, which wild leaves to avoid. Others mashed, pounded, or ground, hands sticky, faces smeared with sap. There was no recipe, just timing and instinct. Too early, and the meat was raw. Too late, and it was blackened cinder, sure to offend the shaman. The master of the fire had real power. Make a meal so good the chief grinned, and you might get first pickings, or even an extra cup of brew. Earn the main dish? You'd be the butt of every joke until next moon. And heaven help you if you mixed the wrong berries. One mistake could turn the feast into a running race for the bushes. The ingredients themselves were prized and rare. A new spice, maybe wild garlic, or an imported pebble of salt, could spark excitement. A tuber nobody recognized had to be tested carefully. Every gatherer and cook had a role, and the fire pit's pecking order was just as brutal as the feast's. Who got to stir? Who tasted first? Who stayed out of the way until it was safe to eat? It was all decided by nods, glances, and who'd earned trust that season. When the food was finally ready, it was carried to the fire with a little ceremony, a song, a chant, or just a whoop to announce something worth celebrating. Each dish was a message. The feast's success or disaster would echo for days. As the flames died down and the air thickened with smoke, grease, and the sense of scorched wood and sweat, the party changed pace. The eating slowed. The laughter turned soft. The songs grew slower, and the clan's careful masks slipped. The final course was sometimes a honey treat, sometimes a handful of nuts, sometimes nothing but a sip of cool water. The most alert still lingered, picking at leftovers, sipping at drink they no longer tasted. But this was when the real business began. Promises whispered over the embers. Deals struck with handshakes. Lovers slipped away into the night, and old debts were repaid or renewed. Some, a little too tipsy, might end up snoring by the coals, dreaming of fat roots, or regretting that third mouthful of wild mushrooms. But the leader's work was far from done. Who left early? Who picked the fight? Who caused trouble? Every moment was noted, every gesture remembered. A spilled drink might be shrugged off. A drunken insult at the wrong elder? That could shift the clan's balance for seasons to come. The feast would end, but its effects would ripple through every circle of the camp, and not everyone got to leave right away. Some curled up by the fire. Others were gently nudged out to sleep in the grass. The least fortunate might end up sprawled in the mud, dreaming of sweeter days. As dawn crept through the trees, the camp was silent, except for the hiss of dying embers, overturned bowls, and the echoes of laughter and ambition. The cooks napped, the wood-gatherers stretched aching limbs, and the chief counted favors and knew grudges. Stone Age feasts were never just about eating. They were performances, negotiations, declarations of power and belonging. Every root, every roast, every drumbeat was part of the same swirling, unruly ritual. And when the last song faded, all that remained was memory. And maybe a sticky beard. If your vision of the prehistoric world is just everyone coated in mud, covered in fleas, and terrified of water, think again. Sure, there were plenty of scruffy foragers, but for many Stone Age clans, communal washing was as regular as a sunrise. And no, it wasn't just a dunk in a cold stream. These were social, ritualized, even surprisingly sophisticated events. Prehistoric bathhouses weren't marble palaces, but every clan had its spots a clear pool, a spring warmed by the sun, a deep bend in the river where stones had been piled for privacy or shelter. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene. It was about resetting, marking the week or moon, sometimes showing off a new tattoo, sometimes sealing a new alliance. Friends washed together, lovers splashed, rivals tried to out-endure the cold. Sometimes, if the mood struck, someone would show up with wildflowers to scent the water or bundles of aromatic leaves to scrub away the sweat of hunting. And for couples, it could get romantic, a secret soak at dusk, maybe a whispered promise, maybe more. Bathing wasn't only for the leaders either. Anyone with enough energy to haul water could join, and the freshest spots filled up fast. In some tribes, the most respected members even helped set up the best bathing place. It was a sign of belonging, a way to show you were ready for a new day or a new hunt. Of course, not everyone loved it. Some grumbled about the cold. Some swore the ancestors would get angry if you wasted too much water. There were always skeptics, but for most, regular communal bathing was just what you did. It meant you could turn up to the next feast, next council, or next hunt looking like you hadn't spent the whole week chasing boar through the swamps. Sure, it wasn't a medieval spa, but for Stone Age people, a good soak was worth its weight in honeycomb. Some Stone Age elders grumbled about the wild laughter, mixed splashing, and occasional flirtation during communal bathing. But even the most stoic shaman would sneak off for a dip, just in a quieter, more sacred part of the stream. In short, the clan bath wasn't just a puddle for washing off mud. It was a prehistoric crossroads where water, status, gossip, and even romance mingled beneath the same overhanging branches. Step into a Stone Age bath gathering, and you might be surprised. These weren't just muddy puddles or mosquito-infested bogs. The best bathing spots were carefully chosen, sometimes even landscaped, not just for function, but for comfort, beauty, and group pride. The bathhouse might be a sun-warmed bend of river shielded by rocks, or a spring where flat stones had been placed for sitting and smooth pebbles collected for scrubbing. In larger clans, the site could be marked with carvings, animal skulls, or piles of sweet-smelling leaves, signaling that this was a place to cleanse and reconnect. Once you arrived, the whole mood shifted. Laughter echoed, sunlight danced on rippling water, and the air carried the scent of crushed mint, pine, and damp earth. The area was divided in a rough but sensible sequence. A flat stone for undracing and piling up skins, a shallow pool for rinsing off dirt, and a deeper spot sometimes warmed with heated stones for a real soak. Some tribes arranged woven mats or branches for privacy. Others lined up at the bank, each waiting their turn while swapping stories or news. Temperature mattered, even then. The young and bold jumped straight into the coldest pools. Elders and those with status would have first choice of the warmest, sunniest spots. In the most luxurious setups, someone would heat rocks in the fire, roll them carefully into the water, and create a hot tub, effect primitive but highly sought after. The more important the guest, the nicer the amenities. Piles of fresh moss for drying, wildflower petals scattered on the surface, maybe even a rare shell comb brought out for grooming. Lighting, of course, was dictated by the sun and moon, but some gatherings would continue by firelight, flickering across water and faces, creating a dreamy, communal atmosphere. And then came the little luxuries. Bowls of melted animal fat or bear grease for smoothing skin, twigs with soft leaves for brushing teeth, aromatic bundles of sage or mint for freshening breath and spirit. The highest status bathers might even have someone help scrub their back or braid their hair. If you'd done well on the hunt, you'd be offered a shovelful of scented water for rinsing, or a handful of rare salt for exfoliating. Even if you were just a quick-handed berry picker, for an hour or two, you could feel like clan royalty. These bath gatherings weren't just about cleaning. They were about showing who you were, who you belonged to, and where you fit in the group. The architecture wasn't walls and tiles, it was circles of trust, places to gossip, spots to flirt, and quiet corners for the elders to share secrets. The riverbank wasn't just a place for soap, it set the tone for everything that happened next. Once undressed and waist-deep in the water, bathing followed a surprising structure, a ritual of soaking, scrubbing, and socializing, part tradition, part necessity. Most began by wading in slowly, warming up, and letting dirt soak off, while others dived in for a shock of cold to wake up the bones. Clan helpers, usually the younger kids or those hoping for praise, would bring handfuls of sand, smooth pebbles, or leafy branches to scrub backs, arms, and feet. The soap was often animal fat or ground-up roots and leaves, sometimes with a dash of ash for extra grit. There was even exfoliation. People used curved mussel shells or rough stones, gently scraping off the day's dust, sweat, and memories. It wasn't always gentle, sometimes it stung, but afterward, you felt clean down to the bones. Special hair care was reserved for those with the best locks. Someone might comb your hair with carved bone, massage in a bit of wild honey, or dab vinegar made from foraged fruit. Men might get their beards braided or have their faces wiped down with a stinging herbal wash said to keep away bad spirits, or at least annoying insects. No detail was too small. The right shell for scooping water, the right leaves for polishing teeth, the right chant or story to tell while soaking. If you could afford or had earned the luxury, you'd be pampered by the clan's finest, if only until the next hunt called everyone back to the mud and the chase. Bathing was never just a chore. It was a ritual, a reset, and the social glue that helped Stone Age humans survive another day in a world that was always one storm away from chaos. Women in the clan sometimes had their long hair carefully combed out with river-scented oils, then dried by the fire or under the open sun. The most prestigious bath gatherings, usually reserved for elders, hunters, or healers, offered special grooming, braiding, tick-checking, smoothing with animal fat, and tending to minor scrapes or nettle stings. The final rinse might involve fresh, cool water poured over your head from a carved gourd, or if you were lucky, ladled out of a pot where mint or pine needles had steeped. Drying off meant using a prized piece of fur, or if you weren't so fortunate, whatever clean grass or woven net was on hand. But none of this was just about washing off yesterday's hunt. It was about pride. Looking clean and well-groomed showed your place in the clan. In a world where smell could mark you as an outsider or even attract predators. Bathing was about resetting your status as much as your scent. The communal bath was more than hygiene, it was a social arena, a forum where plans were made and stories swapped, where a wink or a side eye could mean everything. Let's talk business. Stone Age style. The riverbank bath was neutral ground for negotiating trades, making pacts, or mending old quarrels. No spears, no fire-hardened clubs, just water, laughter, and a little steam. Rival foragers might settle disputes over berry patches while rinsing off mud. Hunters could quietly suggest trading a bone tool for a pelt, far away from watchful clan elders. Even shamanic secrets, whose magic was working, whose wasn't, could surface in the soft rush of water and whispers. Then came the gossip, who brought home the biggest boar, who flirted with whose sister at last moon's dance, whose child was suspiciously good at starting fires. Bath time was when the clan's unofficial news network pulsed at full strength. Young ones listened, learning who was in favor, who was in trouble, and who had managed to sneak an extra handful of honeycomb the night before. Clan bath helpers, usually the nosiest kids, became experts at knowing who arrived together and who lingered in the warmest pools. If you wanted the real story of who snuck away from camp, or who was secretly planning a new hunting route, you asked the one swapping out moss towels. And of course, there was flirting. Many Stone Age groups bathed together, men and women, young and old, all in the same stream or pool. Couples might sit close, whispering or sharing a meal of berries and roasted roots. In the more adventurous clans, food would float downriver on leaf rafts, tiny feasts, sent as playful gifts or bold invitations, like the world's oldest version of buying a drink for someone across the room. Sometimes a young hunter, trying to impress, would carve a little bowl or spoon and float it to a favorite companion, hoping to be noticed. There were rules, though. The shaman or eldest women might mutter about modesty, warn against too much giggling in the shallows, or quietly nudge the flirtier bathers to separate pools. Yet temptation was a given. The best bath sites sometimes developed reputations. There were stories, some true, some pure campfire legend, about moonlit trysts, secret deals, and what really happened behind the big rock near the waterfall. Still, for most, bathing was simply how the clan unwound together. In a world with no taverns, no social media, and nowhere else to gather safely after dusk, the steamy river or spring was the Stone Age town square of the nearly naked. This was where alliances were strengthened, tailies grew taller, and every member could see, literally, who was who once the hides and mud came off. Strangely enough, the clan bath wasn't just for scrubbing and gossiping. It also came with refreshment. In many groups, you didn't just rinse, you feasted while you soaked. The best riverbank gatherings included platters of dried meat, wild fruits, or roasted roots passed from hand to hand or floated in bark bowls. For big celebrations or just a successful hunt, the bathing spot would become a makeshift kitchen. Hot stones were rolled into shallow pools to heat water, and sometimes even soup was made right there. Bones, wild greens, and herbs simmered as everyone relaxed in the warmth. Meals were shared on floating bark trays or big leaves, with bits of smoked fish or nuts drifting by, ready to be plucked and nibbled while telling stories. A young man might paddle over with a cup of honey water for a girl he liked. The elders might be served first, as a sign of respect, and anyone caught hoarding the best bits would be the subject of jokes until the next full moon. Attendants, usually the clan's younger teens, hoping for praise or a bigger share at the next meal, would splash between bathers, delivering snacks, refilling water, and making sure everyone got their turn at the best spot in the pool. The whole event was as much about community as cleanliness, a festival of steam, water, food, and the endless, ancient art of human company. The largest clan bathing spots had private pools set back from the main river, marked off by tall reeds or clustered stones, perfect for more intimate gatherings. Here, Those with the most status or the most animal belts could soak with just a close companion or two, sharing roasted meat and honeyed berries by the light of a flickering fire or a crescent moon. The combination of warm water, foraged fruit wine, and the gentle hush of night didn't exactly discourage the flirtier side of bath culture. But it wasn't all luxury. If you couldn't bring fresh meat or fermented berry juice, you'd still be welcomed. Simpler meal's nut cakes, fire-roasted tubers, dried strips of fish or boar made the rounds, passed hand to hand on wooden platters or bark trays. Eating together, especially half-naked under the stars, had a way of loosening even the stiffest hunter or shyest gatherer. Naturally, the clan's elders sometimes grumbled. Sharing food while half-dressed? Scandalous. Laughing with the opposite sex in a warm pool after dark? Practically inviting trouble. And yet, these steamy riverside suppers continued for countless generations, proving that no matter the era, humans will always find a way to add a dash of comfort and a little risk to their routines. The clan bath was never just a bath. It was a feast for all the senses. Hot water, soft laughter, rich scents of herbs and meat, and always the sense that your dinner date might end in romance, rivalry, or a tale that would travel around the fire for moons to come. But for all their warmth and wild charm, communal bathing carried a hidden threat: illness. When sickness swept through a region, fevers, rashes, or the dreaded blights that wiped out whole villages, the riverbank, baths turned almost overnight from sanctuaries of health to sites of suspicion. At first, no one suspected the baths. People believed washing kept evil spirits and disease away. Herbs were tossed into water to cleanse body and soul, with grandmothers swearing by sage, sweetgrass, or pine needles as protection. The clan shaman might even bless the pool, waving smoke and chanting to keep the bad air at bay. But there was a fatal flaw. Clan members shared water, traded towels made from woven grass, passed food hand to hand, and even drank from the same wooden cups. If sickness spread through close contact, dirty water, or a careless cough, a single evening in the baths could spell disaster. Even worse, bath runoff sometimes returned to streams the clan drank from, muddying water with sweat, oils, and sometimes blood from minor scrapes or accidents. When disease struck, elders began to panic. Bans on bathing followed. Pools were abandoned. Herbalists warned against group soaks, arguing it was better to stay dirty than risk bringing death into the camp. Superstition mixed with desperation. The old rules changed. Now, only one family at a time might bathe. Special stones marked sick pools where no one else would go for moons. Shamans redoubled their efforts, burning extra herbs, sometimes even refusing to let people bathe at all if a strange cough or fever swept through. Fear of water replaced fear of dirt. Hygiene suffered, and before long, the familiar stereotype of the smelly wildman was born not from laziness, but from a desperate attempt to stay alive. Beneath the river's shimmering surface, an invisible labor force kept everything running. Clan workers, usually younger teens, and those not strong enough for the hunt-scrubbed rocks, gathered bundles of fresh herbs, hauled water in animal skin bags, and kept fires burning for hot baths. And just like everywhere else, there was a hierarchy, even in the ancient bath. At the top was the elder bathmaster, a respected hunter, healer, or sometimes the oldest grandmother. This figure oversaw everything: who bathed, when, and how, as well as ensuring enough food and stories circulated to keep the mood bright. If something important was happening, like a marriage, a birth, or a new alliance, they'd know first. If a scandal was brewing, or a lover's quarrel needed smoothing, the bathmaster was always in the loop. Below them, bath attendants chosen for their trustworthiness, speed, and knack for keeping secrets tended to guests, prepared hot stones, swapped out fresh herbs, and, when the mood struck, joined in the banter or helped patch a scraped knee. In some clans, Men handled the heavy lifting, women the soothing tasks. In others, it was all mixed, roles shifting with the needs of the group or the latest batch of gossip. The system ran as smoothly as any hunt, because for the ancient clan, a good soak was more than hygiene. It was survival, status, and sometimes the best show in town. The clan's biggest river camps had designated bathmasters, often the eldest or most respected, hunter or matriarch, who organized who got to use the best pools, supervised water heating, and resolved disputes over who'd been splashing too much or eating all the sweet roots. Below the bathmaster were trusted attendants, usually quick-witted, teens or those with a knack for both gossip and getting things done. Their daily jobs included gathering clean reeds for towels, preparing hot stones, mixing fragrant herbs into the water, and helping elders in and out of the deeper pools. A good attendant made you feel like a clan chieftain. A bad one might let your soup get cold or forget to fetch the best berries for your after-bath snack. Then there were the laborers' kids just big enough to carry buckets, old folks too frail for the hunt, or outsiders working for a meal. These were the unsung heroes, trudging back and forth from the river with armfuls of wood or stones, scrubbing mud from the rocks, and dealing with whatever was left after a particularly wild night of riverside revelry. In the largest and most prosperous clans, you might even find musicians, storytellers, or cooks turning the bathing ground into a nightly festival, with food, song, and laughter drifting over the steam. And sometimes, bath workers were more than just workers. They were the clan's best spies. Attendants listened to every whispered deal, every flirtation, every hushed plan for the next hunt or alliance. A bathmaster always knew who was secretly meeting after dark, which couples were growing close, and who was quietly plotting trouble. Chieftains and shamans placed their most trusted eyes at the baths, especially during tense seasons, knowing that information gathered in the steam was often the most valuable of all. Despite their essential role, bath staff often lived on the margins. They were trusted with secrets, but blamed for trouble accused of spreading sickness, stoking rivalries, or knowing too much about everyone's business. And yet, without them, the clan's most cherished rituals, the warmth, the gossip, the sense of togetherness, would fall apart. For all the equality enjoyed in the steamy pool, once you stepped back onto dry land, the social order returned fast. If there was one force always watching the river baths with suspicion, it was the clan's spiritual elders. To them, the bath was a place where purity risked being tainted by temptation, where the line between cleansing the body and awakening the animal was always in danger of being crossed. Officially, the elders approved of hygiene. In fact, some tribal traditions saw ritual bathing as a way to purify the soul before festivals or hunts. But communal bathing, food, flirtation, and song? That, to a pious shaman, was a recipe for mischief. As the clan's bathing culture reached its peak, the elders began to warn of spirits lurking in the steam, of jealousy, temptation, and chaos. Tales circulated about forbidden trysts, secret alliances, or even bath attendants offering special favors behind the reeds. Whether true or exaggerated, the warnings stuck. Some clans imposed new rules: no mixed bathing after dark, no wine near the pools, no music during rituals. In other places, only elders could organize or attend certain baths, making sure everyone behaved. Yet even the holiest elders sometimes sneaked a soak just quietly, after hours, when the moon was high. Over time, as famine, plague, or tribal wars threatened the clan, many began to see the communal bath as dangerous, not just for the soul, but for the body. With each new disease, the rules got stricter. Some villages abandoned group baths entirely, others split by age or family, and elders doubled down on ceremonies to drive out evil spirits from the water. At its height, the riverside bath was the clan's social engine, steamy, lively, and full of camaraderie. But as fear of sickness and stricter moral codes spread, the baths faded from daily life. Plagues were blamed on the pools, and by the time new generations rose, the tradition of communal bathing was mostly gone, replaced by quick washes in private, hurried and alone. The laughter, the gossip, the joy of splashing with friends, all vanished like mist at sunrise. In the end, only stories remained, whispered around fires about the golden age of clan bathing, when a bath wasn't just about cleaning, but about belonging. And while the stones in pools may have crumbled, the memory lingered, a reminder that every ritual, no matter how joyful or necessary, is always at the mercy of change, fear, and the tides of human need. Before the first great trading trails, there were only faint animal paths, winding between forests and wide open plains. It took generations' whole lifetimes of wandering, hunting, and chance encounters for these trails to evolve into true trade networks. The most legendary would one day be called the Bone Road, a winding route linking distant clans, strangers, and distant wonders. Its rise began when one bold clan, desperate for salt and obsidian, ventured farther west than anyone before. What they found was not just new stone, but a world of wild horses, colorful beads, honey, and shells. There was no map, just the sun, the stars, and tailies passed down around the fire. The road itself wasn't one path, but a tangled web of tracks, river crossings, and hidden valleys, shifting with seasons and danger. Some trails vanished under snow, others appeared after floods. Along the way, traders loaded up reindeer or ponies, their backs swaying with pelts, amber, nuts, or the coveted blue stones from far mountains. Each clan handled the journey differently. Some set up relay camps where goods changed hands. Others risked everything to reach the end. There was no true language in common, just gestures, simple words, and the universal language of trade. It was less a road than a bloodstream, pulsing with life, rumor, and risk. But don't get romantic. The journey was rough. Snow blinded, rivers flooded, wolves stalked the shadows. Bandits, sometimes neighboring clans, sometimes outsiders, waited for the slow or the foolish. Every step was a gamble. Make it through, and your clan might feast for months. Fail, and you'd be a cautionary tale, a lost pack in the woods. Still, the prize was worth it. Obsidian knives, rare beads, dried honeycomb, these were treasures as valuable as gold. From the very start, the Bone Road was never just about goods. It was about connection, clans linked by hoof, boot, and barter, customs fused by shared fires and swapped stories. A route born of hunger, hope, and the relentless urge to see what lay beyond the next ridge. And if the landscape wasn't trying to kill you, the weather often finished the job. Temperatures swung wildly, scorching heat by day, bone-numbing cold by night. In spring, flash floods swept through dry riverbeds with terrifying speed. In winter, entire passes froze solid, trapping caravans until starvation or rescue. Water was always precious, always rationed, and sometimes traders dug desperately at dry wells, hoping for a miracle. Disease was another hidden threat. Exhausted travelers packed together for weeks, drinking questionable water, and eating dried or unfamiliar foods were easy prey for outbreaks, everything from dysentery to plague. Medical care was minimal, usually limited to herbal concoctions, charms, and hope. Even so, the Silk Road drew fortune seekers from every corner of the world. Traders learned to read the sky, trust the wisdom of oasis elders, and treat strangers with caution. Today's rival might be tomorrow's partner, or even your rescuer if the weather turned foul. Caravans became microcosms of the world. Chinese scribes traveling with Persian merchants, Arab healers swapping cures with Indian monks, all sharing fireside tailies as sand hissed against canvas and leather. At every major stop, risk and reward danced side by side. In a city like Samarkand, you might meet a Buddhist monk trading manuscripts for food, A Nestorian Christian carrying relics east, a Mongol scout buying Persian steel. Every handshake, every deal, every guarded smile stitched together a patchwork of cultures, faiths, and ambitions. Ideas traveled faster than camels. Printing and papermaking, algebra and astrology, fairy tales and fables, new recipes and new gods. At a Silk Road inn, a merchant might taste wine from the Caucasus, listen to a bard from Kashgar, and wake up beside a stranger from the far west with dreams of gold and stories of distant wars. The Silk Road's true legacy was not just silk or spices, but this relentless mixing, this churning tide of goods, beliefs, and human connection across impossible terrain. The oases, the shrines, the markets, even the dangers, each was a thread in the immense tapestry that stretched from the Yellow River to the Mediterranean's edge. Without the risks, the Silk Road would have been ordinary. It was the possibility of loss and the hope of survival, the promise of discovery. That gave it life, and that still echoes in the legends we tell about it today.